Okay, so welcome everyone to this panel put on by the Engineering Biology Research Consortium Student and Postdoc Association. So my name is Ross. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Zandstra lab at the University of British Columbia, and I'll be hosting this panel today along with my other wonderful co-hosts who are all members of EBRC and or the SPA. So really quick background on me. I did my PhD at MIT with Ron Weiss in mammalian synthetic biology, studying control systems in for gene expression. And I currently work on manufacturing T cells from iPSC for scalable CAR T therapy. So I'll hand it off to each of the other panelists to quickly introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the panel. Julietta.
Hi, everybody. My name is Julietta. I'm currently a postdoc with EBRC, but I did my PhD at Colorado State with a background in neuroscience and sex differences.
Hi, everyone. I'm Efrain, and I'm a postdoc at University of Wisconsin-Madison and a fellow of the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Institute. And I did my PhD at Iowa State using engineered microbes for plastic solutions.
Hi, I am Piyush Nanda. I'm a fifth-year PhD student in Andrew Murray's lab at Harvard, and I work on imaging single-cell metabolism.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gianna. I'm a fourth-year bioengineering PhD student at Penn, and I'm working on non-genetic mechanisms of drug resistance in melanoma.
Hi, everyone. My name is Klauer. I'm a PhD student in chemical engineering at the University of Delaware, and I'm working on the discovery and engineering of enzymes for plastics deconstruction.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, everyone. So I stopped the screen sharing so that we can see each other a bit easier. And we'll start off with the first question to the panel, which is, what does your lab look for when you have prospective PhD students or your former lab, in the case of Julietta or people that have been a postdoc?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things my lab looked for was basically the passion to learn and the desire to want to learn, the ability to listen and take critical feedback and improve on what they're doing. So like adaptability, I guess, in the student, and again, down to the passion of wanting to be there and the passion for science.
I think just building off of what Julietta said as well, I think that passion to learn is really important. I think people get worried that they might not have a ton of research experience. I think that's the important thing. And I think one way to directly show that is something that we always look for is people who come with ideas. Like, hey, I've read a couple of these papers. I see what you do. Have you tried doing this or that? That's usually a good way to help yourself stand out.
I definitely think it's more about the potential than the background. We'll teach you the skills and the techniques. Even if you know them already, we'll want to make sure that you got them nailed down. So that's not really what makes you the best candidate. It's just the desire to be in the lab, to make contributions, the drive to put in the work and get things done.
Okay, thanks, guys. I think it's a good intro. So now let's talk about when you were a student, and maybe we can have everyone answer this one. What was your approach to interviews as a prospective grad student?
I can start. So I think I initially came in with a very kind of like good or bad view of labs of like, there's maybe like a couple labs that aren't great, but you just have to find those, but all the other ones are good. And what I really found throughout was that it's way more about like what the right fit is for you, and that it could be a lab that's great, but it's just not the right environment for you. And so I think kind of getting out of a very simplistic model of it and getting into more of an idea of like, okay, what am I looking for? How do I best work? Where will be the best environment for me to succeed? And going from that is a good idea.
I completely agree. When I was interviewing to be a grad student, I think I was more worried about you know, is the professor a fellow of this and that, and you know, what journals do they publish, and sure, that's not important, but I think it's definitely the fit is the thing that you should be focusing on. You could go to a very renowned lab and never interact with your PI, or not receive enough support, have to do everything on your own. So if you can find a good mentor, I think that's more important than prestige.
I think just going off of that point, that was actually something that I focused on a lot as I was doing these interviews, is trying to find the right fit. I knew I wanted to work with somebody who was earlier in their career and had more energy and time and effort to give me some of that attention. So I wasn't, feeling like I was totally isolated. And so when it was, in the interview, my turn to ask questions, a lot of my questions were focused more around mentorship style, maybe the culture of the labs, those kind of things, because I think you can already get a feel for what the science looks like. So I guess my advice would be to definitely not neglect those things, because they're just as, if not more important than the actual project that you're going to be working on.
Yeah,
I
I
can go
think
next.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, sorry, you can go ahead. Yeah, I almost had like a culture shock when I interviewed for the first time, because I thought that someone was going to ask me like, okay, what are the all proteins involved in like transcription? But I think in the US, it's much more about like knowing like what your interests are, and because like people who are interviewing, they're basically trying to figure out like whether they'll be able to find like a lab where you will be able to do like the science that you're interested in. So I think like discussing about like the science that you're interested in and the kind of mentorship style that you prefer, I think those things are like important parts of like an interview.
And I think an important piece to consider is, even though it is like an interview, they're interviewing you, you're also interviewing them, and you're trying to determine if, like everybody has said, if it's a good fit, if this is the type of mentor you want, if these are the students that you're going to want to work alongside. And one of the biggest pieces of advice that really helped me was talking to the other students in the lab, and even students that collaborate with the lab, to see what their opinions were on the lab and the mentor, because sometimes they can give you more insight than just talking to the PI.
Cool, thanks everyone. I'll add like a couple of things that you will also want to look out for. So they're probably going to ask you a bit about what you did in your undergrad days, or if you're like a master's student, what you did in your master's. And when you answer that, maybe think about how you can connect it to the lab of the person that you're talking to. You actually want to use it to get information from them, because it's not just about them interviewing you, you're also kind of interviewing them. And so hopefully it's sort of like a two-way conversation where you give a bit of information about you, and then you relate that to what you want to do in the future, and then get information about them, about where they're going. I liked, when I was doing interviews, to ask like, how does this work, where are you going with that, to kind of see what the trajectory is, because the papers that you see were all finished potentially years ago, even if it was published like this year, might have been in review for a while. Okay. So what's something unexpected from your experience with the interview process?
I can answer here. I think something, I guess, unexpected, or something that I wasn't quite aware of when I was going through the interview process, is that the PI that you're talking to wants you to be a good fit just as much as you want them to be a good fit. So a lot of times it kind of feels like this daunting thing where you're kind of going into it thinking they might be grilling you, and that it might be, kind of this really stressful environment, but they want you to be someone who's going to succeed in their lab as well. And so I wouldn't go at it with with any sort of fear or anything like that. I would just go into it with an open conversation, trying to figure out, whether, really it's just both of you trying to feel out whether it's a good match or not.
For me, I during my undergrad, most of my experiences were industry focused, and I was on the path to just getting a job instead of going to grad school. So when I came to that stage of interviewing for grad schools and presenting myself, I did it very much the way I would during an industry interview, very polished, very um, structured, coming, at them with everything I've got. And turns out that academia is a little bit more laid back, and they were like, yeah, let's just talk, like, calm down. I'm not trying to like make you go through, fire to get into my lab. I want to get to know you. So that was, I had to do some sort of like recalibration when I started interviewing for PhDs.
Something that surprised me as well was, and I guess that I didn't really fully appreciate when I was first interviewing, was that the entire lab was going to turn over during my PhD. And so like it's very important to make sure that you feel like you fit in with like the current grad students and the current people in the lab, but it's also just as important to hear what that professor's priorities are for hiring, because now that I'm a fourth year, there's one or two other people that were here when I started, but everybody else is brand new.
Big piece that surprised me during my interview was the amount of conversation that wasn't on science, and we found other things that we could talk about. Like I think we talked about fishing for half an hour and hiking, and I mean that your mentor, your prospective mentor, is somebody that not only is your mentor, but someone that you want as a friend, I guess, as a colleague, especially going past grad school into postdoc. Like they're going to be that person that you can bounce ideas off of, that you can go to for advice, or even go grab a drink with later on. And so I think that was, at least for me, that was an important piece, was knowing that they could be a mentor, but also a colleague at a certain point.
Yeah, something that might be unexpected for a lot of people is the thought of the lab trying to see if we are the right environment to take you from A to B. So when our lab is interviewing prospective grad students or even undergraduates, we think about like, what are your long-term goals, and is this the right place for you to get to where you want to go? Because you might have some overlapping interests with the lab, and you might be able to come here and do cool things, but if it's not exactly going to get you to your future goal, it might not be the best place. And so it's about that alignment, and that's sort of like one aspect of the fit. There's a lot of aspects of fit, but like our grad school is a training time, so it's about you getting to where you want to be at the end of it, not just doing some research in a lab.
I do want to add to that. You mentioned long-term goals, and that's absolutely right. But also don't feel the pressure that when we're saying long-term goals, it's that you have to have your life figured out, right? You don't need to go into a first-year PhD interview and say, oh, I'm going to be a professor at this university by this date. Like you don't need to have that much of a detail in terms of your goals. It's more about what you want to get out of the experience, what type of expertise do you want to develop, what type of, what do you want to be known for at the end of your PhD, and what type of problems you maybe want to be tackling. So it's not that you need to feel a pressure to have absolutely every single step figured out. It's just, we want to know that you have a plan and you're not just, I came to grad school and just to figure out my life. It has to be a balance. There's something in between there.
Yeah, you definitely don't need to know if you're going to go to a postdoc or industry afterwards, but you should be thinking about it and understand how grad school is going to help you decide this, and how like a specific lab training environment might help your decision or your path. Because there's a lot of paths that can go either way or go back and forth, and that's totally fine. When I was starting, I didn't know which way I wanted to go. Okay, so besides the interactions with the professors, which is like a common, you probably have a lot of one-on-ones. If you're on like an interview visit, or if you're actually directly applying to a lab, you'll have sort of one-on-one interviews with the faculty, probably via Zoom. What other things should interviewees be prepared for a typical visit, couple of days to a university?
I guess in terms of what you need to prepare for, just be rested, feel comfortable. If you need to stand in front of a mirror and practice something, do it. But I would also say to maybe do some research. If it's an in-person visit or an interview, do your research on the town, on maybe, you know, like housing and culture and the vibes in general. Because during that visit, the university will want to provide you with, you know, sell you the place, say this is a place you'll feel, you know, comfortable in. And I was completely ignoring that at the beginning, I guess. And so when they were like, "Oh, do you want to know where housing is cheap?" I was like, I wasn't even thinking about that at this moment. And so if you have certain non-negotiables about where you want to live, um, have some questions about that as well, so that you can answer them during your visit and during your interview.
I think another really important thing for these visit weekends is being prepared to ask the right questions to grad students in the labs you might want to join. Because oftentimes when you're going through the interview with the PI, you're going to get them at their best and they're going to be giving you their best sales pitch. And you'll find that you'll get a lot of honest answers about lab culturing and mentorship style of a PI by asking the grad students, especially the more senior grad students who have been there, you know, a while and had a longer standing relationship with that PI. So I think come prepared with those sorts of questions, potentially even the same questions that you're asking the PI in these interviews, but about the lab culture, mentoring style, meeting schedules, all those kind of things. So you can get a feel for if personality wise a lab is kind of the right fit for you.
Yeah, that's going to set us up well for the second half of this panel, where we can dive into these types of questions a bit more. But I'll do a couple more responses, and then we can get into audience Q&A for this sort of first half of the panel.
I was just going to add on that it's important to remember that the whole experience is an interview, not just the time that you're with the professor or you're with the grad students in the lab, but if there's social events or even in between different one-on-ones with professors, that's still considered your interview. And the other grad students, they do have a say in, sometimes they have a say in the candidates that get chosen for the program. So it's important to be professional the entire time, not just when you're with the professor.
Yeah, I'll also suggest like maybe hanging out with like other students who are also interviewing for the same program. I guess like most of them are going to get into the PhD program and you'll be friends, and like later on they can give you information about like rotations and like other things. So I think it's like pretty important also to make that connections. I think a lot of PhD programs, they try organizing social events like later on, but I think there's also big gap between like when you interview and you start your grad school, and I think like just knowing other people would be like super helpful.
Yeah, making friends on the interview trail is definitely a fun thing, especially when several of you end up going to the same place. You sort of have friends. Definitely happened for me. Okay, so let's open it up to some audience Q&A, and we'll do that for about 20 minutes, and then we'll get into the next part related to how to zero in on the program and choosing a program in a lab. So I see that we have a couple of things in the chat already. So we'll start with that. So Hakan asks, can you provide some examples of questions that might be asked in the interview? And one I mentioned before is you'll be probably asked about what you did in your prior research. So have like a very short 2-minute overview of what you did prepared, and then you'll probably get follow-up questions related to that. But try not to go on too long with it, because you want to get to your questions with faculty. I think the meetings are usually 30 minutes, maybe an hour, depending on the interview. So you don't have tons of time. You don't want to like droll on for too long, like I am right now.
I would also add from that it's also very important to be able to articulate why you did what you did in undergrad or your previous work, even if that was just a very small part of your PhD student or your postdoc project or whoever. It's really important to be able to explain the reasoning for conducting that specific experiment or asking that specific question, because that's something that my lab definitely looks for, is somebody who can clearly talk about exactly what they did, but also what the rationale or the motivation was.
I think another important thing is why you want to pursue a PhD. That was a question I got a lot in these interviews, and presumably you have a good answer for that question. And, you have an idea of, of some sense of self, and you've written your statements of purpose and all that kind of stuff. But I think definitely be prepared to to answer that question as to why you want to do this.
If you have things in your resume that fall outside of the traditional scope, for example, I had a lot of like policy involvement, a lot of extracurriculars, a lot of stuff that had nothing to do with science, but things I was passionate about, you'll get questions about that. It's not a bad thing. It's just they'll be curious, right? They want to get to know you. They want to know why you were investing your time in all these things, and that don't seem to advance your scientific career. So if you have anything that's super non-traditional in your resume, it's not a bad thing. It could differentiate you. Just make sure that you're ready to talk about it.
Okay, so I'll go to the next one from the chat, and feel free again to put more into the chat or raise your hand, and then we can call on you to ask your question. So question from Sheik. For programs where you don't apply to join a specific lab, instead having rotations, who conducts the interviews, and how are they different if you're not talking to your potential mentor? So yeah, it's definitely a good question for those programs that are less like direct admission. Anybody want to tackle this?
I can talk about it. I think a lot of the chemical engineering programs are like that. You will meet with professors. It might not be a professor that you want to go into their lab. Usually they try, they have your application materials before they decided to invite you for an interview. So they'll probably try to find professors within the general scope of your interest that you'll meet with, but it's not a commitment. So it's good because it's some sort of relief on your end that you don't have to be convincing the professor to let you into their lab immediately. They just want to get a sense of you. They want to get a sense of your goals and your own personal plan that they'll probably discuss as a committee later on. So it's not going to be an interview where they're asking you like, oh, what technique you want to learn in my lab. It's more about what you want out of your PhD in general.
Yeah, probably important to say that the faculty don't necessarily assume, right, that you're applying to their lab directly. So they're trying to get a sense of everybody collectively. Gianna, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add, so I'm in a very direct match program, but I interviewed at both, and I agree with what's been said about programs where it's more rotation-based. I would also add that regardless, the other professors at the university could be people on your thesis committee or teaching your classes or collaborating with you, or just generally establishing the culture. And so it's important, even if you are talking to a direct match program, to still consider that vibe that you're getting from the other people. But yeah, there's a little bit less of the stress for sure if you're applying to a program with rotations, even though you're still talking to the professors.
Yeah, and I think we can come back to rotations as well themselves when it comes to like choosing a lab as a discussion topic. Something I'd like to point out too, for when you're meeting with the faculty that you're not really interested necessarily in their lab, is you can make sure to still ask them questions about what they do, and professors are always happy to talk about what their lab does. And then you might learn something that is interesting for like collaborations or whatever. But importantly, you can also ask them about other things that you wouldn't necessarily have time to ask a faculty that you're having a more deep research discussion with. So you can ask them about the program, other recommendations that they have, and they can sort of give you more information that way from the faculty perspective.
Can I add something here? It's a little bit of a warning. I think some students are so focused on the professors that they do want to work with that when they have to meet with someone they might not be interested in, they make it very obvious, right? You do not act dismissive in that interview. Do not act bored. Do not just sit there quietly. You're joining an academic community, you're joining an academic department. If that person is outside the field you're in, it might become a collaborator through a project. It might be a professor that's going to teach a course you take. It might be a person you need because they run the office of X, Y, and Z, and you need that. Do not Like that will leave a bad impression on your part, and professors will talk about it, right? That would be a red flag in a student. But if you go to another professor and you're not respectful of their time because you're not interested in joining their specific lab, it happens more than you think. So that's why I wanted to give that heads up.
So Efrain, there's a specific question for you in the chat, which was if you could elaborate on the sort of questions that you got that were not related specifically to research. And if other people have similar experience, you can talk about that too.
As I mentioned before, it was never a bad thing, right? It was people were curious about things in my resume and they just wanted to know more. For example, when I was an undergrad, the last 2 years, I served as a trustee of my university. I, helped oversee and manage 11 campuses. I was, in a lot of higher ed administration roles. And so that's not usual for a person going into a PhD in chemical engineering. They wanted to know more. So I told them how I ended up in that position. I told them the story of how, my university was going through bankruptcy and there was all this, difficulties going on. And I was an advocate for public higher education. And so my advocacy gave me exposure and I was appointed to the board to help steer the university through those difficult times. And I thought, that's definitely something that they considered as good. It gave me a lot of soft skills that helped me be successful during my PhD and that I will use for the rest of my career. So I think you should always frame it in a positive way. If you want to pivot because you think it's too outside of the scope, always try to tie it back to how it's going to help you and what you learn from it and how it can help you as a grad student if that's what you're worried about. But I will say, if you meet with a professor who views these extracurriculars, who views something you're passionate about and you being involved in something you're passionate about as a negative, as a distraction, then maybe that professor is not a great match for you.
That actually reminded me of an experience with my mentor. There's a lot of skills that translate from like non-related science jobs or they translate from non-related science jobs into the lab. For instance, my current mentor or my past mentor, he only really took students that were in the service industry or bartenders or waitresses because they have a lot of skills, multitasking and staying on top of things and being able to stay calm in very high stress situations, what sometimes a PhD is comprised of. And so that was just funny how it was just a random, oh yeah, I used to bartend, and he latched onto that specifically. And I think that's one of the main reasons why he took me into his lab, so it's just, yeah, surprising on what other outside science skills can translate back.
Okay, so while I wait for more questions, I have a couple more things to mention, not related to that question. So we talked a lot about going and interviewing for rotations and, or not interviewing for rotations, but applying to schools where you're applying to the program first, which often have rotation structures, but not necessarily. So often in these interviews, you're not going to be asked to present something unless you're specifically told to. So don't feel like you need to have slides ready. It doesn't hurt to have a few from your prior research, but it's not usually an expectation. If you are directly applying to a lab, some of the things that we're talking about are going to be, much more on the directive of working in that lab as opposed to overall fit for the program. And if you do apply directly to a lab, you probably start off with some kind of Zoom interview with the lab. Maybe also you'll then be directed to have Zoom interviews with students in the lab. And at some point, you'll probably get invited for a interview on site, in which case you might get asked to present. That's sort of case by case, but mostly involves showing up and meeting with more people and so on. And a lot of the point of that, as we've talked about, is assessing fit, interests, how you interact with people. Are you interested in what they're doing? Is there a clear path for you in the lab and so on? So similar stuff, but it would just be a lot more involved for one specific lab than it would be for the more rotation focused programs. Does anybody here have, like, did you do direct applications? And do you have anything more that you want to add related to that?
Yeah, so I direct matched. The way that Penn Bioengineering does it is you either have one or two professors' names on your offer letter, and if you have one, you just start right away. If you have two, you do those rotations during your first semester. I really think there's a lot of pros and cons to both, and it's just what your own personal preference is. So I really loved that I knew exactly what I was getting into. I could start talking to people over the summer and start thinking about projects. I didn't have to worry about if there was going to be a spot in the lab that I wanted to join. I also know plenty of people that rotated and had great experiences with that, and that was something they wanted. They didn't want to already be committed. So I would really think about the pros and cons of both and where you feel like you fall on that.
Are there any other, okay. Are there any other things that you would recommend to ask the PI during a one-on-one interview that we haven't talked about yet? So for example, one thing I was thinking about was asking to get connected to students in the lab. They might offer this anyway, but you only have so much time to talk to the PI. If you're interested to learn more about the lab, you can say, hey, can I get in touch with a student or two? And they're usually happy to pass along an email and sort of connect you together. And then you can meet with that person and have a bit more of an in-depth discussion about what they're working on, which can be good for sort of learning more about the lab. And if you're interested in it, connecting to the next part of the panel, I guess. Any other things that might be helpful to be thinking about during the interviews?
I think one thing that's important if you're interviewing to be directly admitted into a lab is just talking about expectations around mentor and mentee relationships. So I know there's a nice chart that my PI uses. Essentially, it has a list of a bunch of tasks, in terms of like manuscript writing, doing experiments, presenting work at conferences, all that, and kind of there's like almost like a scale bar as to how much of that falls on the mentee, how much of that falls on the mentor. So I think just talking through those things and the things that are important to you, whether that's getting a lot of papers published, whether that's getting a lot of support and having a lot of one-on-one time, those kind of things, just trying to get a feel for what those expectations might look like. Because I tell my undergrads this all the time, but this is probably the only time in your life you're going to get to pick who your boss is. And so since you have these options, you should really ask those questions and make sure that it's going to be, a really fruitful relationship for both of you.
I completely agree. And when you're asking those things, don't focus only on professional expectations, right? How many papers and how many conferences. Ask about the day to day, right? So I can tell you that for me, it's an important thing is do not have a specific schedule. I work when I work. If I work better at night, and so my PhD advisor never cared when I was in the lab or how many hours. She only cared about results, and as long as I was making progress, she didn't even look up at how many hours and when I was in the lab and when I was not. Other professors run their lab like like a real job where you have to be here by 7. If you're late, it's something that I'm going to be noticing. So if that's those small things can make a PhD more or less comfortable for you. So ask about those things, right? I'm not saying turn down a lab because they want you to be there in the morning, right? That's not too much to ask, but you do want to know what is expected the day to day before you commit to something.
One important question I wish I would have asked was funding for the lab and what kind of money they had coming in, what grants they had. I think I lucked out because my PI had enough funding where I didn't have to teach every semester, but I had a colleague who their lab didn't have funding, and so they had to teach for the department, and their PhD ended up taking 9 years instead of 4 because they were teaching so much of the time. And so that's also really important, is to know how this PI is going to fund you and what they expect you to put in terms of teaching, teaching timed as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. So let's move on to sort of the next set of questions, because we're really starting to dig now into evaluating a fit. And I really liked what Ross said about getting to choose your boss, which is definitely a fun way to think about it. So, so let's sort of dive into that. Why did you choose to join the lab that you are currently working in, or in your PhD if you're currently a postdoc?
I'll actually start just talking because the program that I'm in and most of the programs that I kind of interviewed for weren't direct admit. And so I think an important thing to consider is that when you're going through these advisor selection processes, a lot of times, there are a lot of people who might want to join the same lab, and you kind of go through this, at least in my program, kind of this like in the fall, more or less of a dating program where you're kind of feeling out different PIs that you might want to work for. They're feeling you out. And so a piece of advice that I got when I was going through this process is to go somewhere where you have multiple good options. That's something that drew me to the department that I'm in now, because I knew just based on the research and from the interview weekend, meeting a couple people, there are 3 to 4 PIs that I'd be totally fine working with. And so it wasn't the end of the world if I didn't get my first choice. So I think that's one important thing to consider if you're not going into a program that's going to be direct admit to a lab.
I can share. So for I did my PhD with the professor, one of the professor I did my last summer RU with. So when I decided that I wanted to go to grad school and I didn't want to do necessarily industry immediately, I did an RU to get a feel of it of academic research. And so during that summer, she got me an admission before the application even started. Like, she recommended me to the department. She gave me everything I needed during the summer. She saw that I knew how to work in the lab, so she gave me an independent project instead of having to work with an undergrad. I got a publication out of it. She was an amazing mentor. So I was accepted to the department. I met with various professors and ranked them and anything. And at the beginning, I was hesitant about choosing her as the first choice because she was very upfront that she was in the transition period and she didn't have any active grants to hire me in. She could take me in. She had general money, but there wasn't a specific project. So I could have ended up working on anything and I wouldn't know what that would be. I met with other professors that had specific projects that I would join that were really great, but they weren't as interested in when they were asking questions of me and discussing how I would join the lab. The professor that didn't have funding that got me the admissions and got me into a paper as an undergrad, all of her questions was very much what she could do about me. And the other professor that was I was tied with, what the questions were, well, I need, can you jump into this? Can you get finishes? It was just a different philosophy of what I could give to them versus what they could give to me. And I chose the person that was invested in me and in my future.
Maybe I can go next. Oh, sorry, Ross, you wanted to.
No, go for it.
Yeah. So I think I was like looking for like labs where I have my like kind of like independent project where it's just my thing and like there are not other people working on it, so that I can learn how to do things and stuff like that. And I guess that was one of the reasons why I chose like Andrew's lab for my PhD. And apart from that, I think the other thing that I also looked forward to was basically having some PI who's as excited as you for like your PhD project, because I think that's going to be like an important part when you're like encounter situations where like a project is not going well. So whether your PI is like investing enough time to help you like get out of like all sorts of problems. So I think like having like PI who is like excited about your project as much as you are, I think that's like one of the important things that, like I look for.
one more thing that I want to add that we haven't chatted about much yet is when you're looking to join a specific lab, definitely think about the people in that lab and the culture, because you want to get to know in the process of choosing the lab as many of, I think, the students and postdocs in the lab as possible to kind of get a feel for what the lab culture looks like, because you're going to be in this lab for 5 or 6 years, and these are going to be the people you're spending every single day with. And so you want to make sure it's a good personality match, not only with the PI, but with the people you're really going to be spending all of your time with every day in the lab space and in the office space. So I would definitely put a lot of priority on feeling that out as well. Once you have a couple, top choice labs that you're thinking about, really thinking about what those relationships might look like, where you think you might be able to get support from other PhD students and postdocs and in the lab, and where you think, people that you would just enjoy spending a lot of your time with.
Yeah, one thing I want to add related to Ross's comments is, oh no, now I'm like losing my train of thought. Oh, no. Okay, sorry, come back to me. Okay, I'll just talk about something else instead, and then maybe I'll think of what I was thinking. Okay, so I can talk about my PhD and postdoc looking for lab experience. So my PhD, I was like new to coming to synthetic biology, so I was really excited about it. The first sort of decision point was like which school to go to for synthetic biology. And so at one point I was choosing between MIT and Berkeley, obviously like good options there. And the way I ended up swaying towards MIT was that it was the labs there, and getting to Ross's point about like there's multiple labs that you want to be interested in. This was the case for me at both schools, but the labs at MIT were more focused on like circuit design. And so as opposed to like metabolic engineering. So that sort of leaned me that way, is because like the topic was a bit narrowed down. And then when it came to choosing labs, the lab that I ended up joining was like one of the ones doing mammalian synthetic biology. So I kind of narrowed down that way. And then I just had like really good interactions with the postdocs and students in the lab as I was doing my rotation. I didn't really have any negative experiences in other labs, but I just felt like that really felt like a home for me in terms of both the work and the people. And so I kind of stuck around during the rotations and ended up joining the lab. For my postdoc, or one thing I want to add to that too is that the PI compared to a lot of MIT students or MIT faculty is a bit more like available. Because a lot of faculty you might meet with them once a month, if that, especially if they're like a big lab. And so somewhat surprisingly, even though it was a fairly sizable lab, the PI would tend to meet with people every couple of weeks. And so that was nice to be able to have a bit more interactions. And so then later, when I wanted to do my postdoc, I was like, okay, I need a more hands-off PI because I've had too many meetings, right? And so in addition to like the research direction I was looking for, is actually actively looking for a place where I could sort of operate more independently and have a lot of like mentorship roles in the lab as like a mentor for grad students, undergrads, and things like that. And so then I was sort of looking for a different thing. And then luckily the lab that I was most interested in, again, academically, was also a lab that worked well for me in terms of fit for those kinds of things as well. And I did remember the thing I was thinking about for Ross's thing. So looking for a place where there's multiple labs you can work in, and then look for also labs where there's multiple projects you could see yourself working on. Because chances are you actually will work on multiple projects, not just like one main thing. And if something goes south with funding, you might need to adapt. And so make sure you're joining a thing, not just for one task, but like because the ecosystem fits well with you. And I think that's what I felt when joining the lab. I was like, there's too many cool things going on. Like, what do I even choose to work on, And eventually we worked out projects to do. Okay. So besides like the research, so we talked about like, make sure there's research labs you want to work in for a program. Were there other things that you looked for in your grad program that helped you decide whether to go there or not?
Yeah, so one of the things that drew me to Penn was that there's a really large number of grad students here. There's like 12 or 13 graduate and professional programs, and the grad student to undergrad ratio is about 1 to 1. And I knew I would be moving to a city where I probably wouldn't know anybody. And so that was definitely something that I had in mind was, a place where there would be a lot of other people around my age doing similar things, and a place where there was a lot of, we kind of talked about this, but like social activities and just other things, student organizations going on to be able to meet people.
I definitely think people are important, especially if you're moving to a new city and you might not know people there. Make sure it's a friendly atmosphere, right? There are departments where, they're so competitive that for them to succeed, you have to fail, and then you have to be, completely in your toes all the time and always on. And there are departments where everyone's just friendly, right? Everyone helps each other. Everyone, supports each other when the experiment fails, and you need to go have a drink to calm down and forget about it for a little bit. So I think that's super important. A PhD is a very long commitment, and it will take a lot of hours and a lot of effort. You want to make sure you're doing that in an environment where you like the people and you have you can build your mini community.
One thing to look out for is if you're really interested to go the industry route, or if you're thinking about like at some point in my PhD, I want to do an internship. You might think about, are there local internship opportunities? Will I need to go elsewhere? Is that important? Flying and living somewhere else for an internship is definitely doable, but if you see yourself wanting to do it in the place that you'll be operating, then you might want to focus on places that have a lot more local industry that you could work at as part of an internship. Okay, so besides the stuff that we've covered already, what are some things to look for in your supervisor, whether it's in your something you can suss out in your one-on-one interactions or something that you can suss out from the students and in their lab?
One thing that I really looked for in a supervisor was them being supportive, and I like positive feedback. So being able to give me positive feedback on things that I was doing, but also help give advice on other things I could do better. And an open door policy was really important to me because going into grad school, I didn't have any research experience whatsoever. And so I always had questions about how different techniques were to be done or the best way to do something. And so being able to go into their office and ask them really anytime and anything was a really important thing that I looked for. And there's someone that's passionate about science and being a mentor and wanting their students to succeed was also a really important factor that I looked for.
I think for me, a big thing was the focus on career development. I know Efrain talked about this kind of already with his PhD supervisor, but I think it's something that might even be easier to suss out, before you join the lab with the PhD students, asking them, kind of, when you want to, go to a conference or go to some sort of, a seminar, professional development thing, are you able to do that? What does that look like? What sort of opportunities does your PI give you to kind of succeed? Do you have to really seek those out, or are they, kind of sending you stuff that they think would be a good fit for you? I think those kind of things to feel out, just really how much attention and care your mentor will give to your professional development is something that was really important to me, and I think that should be important to everybody. And I think I think you can really get a good idea of that by feeling out from the students what sort of, what those sort of interactions look like from people who are going to be, people who are already in the lab.
I think one more thing would be maybe finding out how your potential PI professor operates in the field. And this is something difficult to assess from the outside, but do you have a very collaborative PI that has a super big network, and when you need something, you're working on a new technique and that person just picks up the phone and calls the professors from the lab it came from? Or are they the competitive type that they don't want to reach out to anyone because they want to do it themselves and they want to be and I'm not saying one style is better or the other. It's just, it might, if you have specific goals that you want to accomplish that are beyond what your professor can provide you, can they at least get you to the person that you need, right? And so I worked with a very collaborative PI. I during my PhD, I'm focusing during my PhD, but also during my postdoc. And I remember one time, it wasn't me, but one of the students, the funding fell through for some reason. And, there was an in-between. And instead of asking her to TA, one of her buddies' professor just put her on her grants. And because that's how they operate, they just help each other out. And you need me to cover your student, I'll cover your student for a semester. So those relationships that your professor has and how your professor interacts with other people in the field that you want to reach to could be, I would say, put it low on the list, but it could be important.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the lab environment. So what did you look for in a lab environment? So I guess this would mostly be like the people that aren't the PI in the lab.
I think some of the things that I looked for, there are definitely things both research and personal. So on the research side, people that were going to be willing to take the time to teach me new techniques, people that I was going to be able to sit down with and have kind of like a research conversation with. I think on the other side, people that had hobbies and interests outside of the lab, because that can kind of be a red flag if you talk to the grad students and you ask them, like what they like to do in the city, and they don't really have much of an answer for you. So that was something that was really nice to see, was that everybody, had other interests and had other things they liked doing, and that gave me more confidence that the work-life balance was going to be good because people were well-rounded.
Related to that, I think something you can look for is like, do the grad students like each other? Do they have fun? Do they hang out outside of lab? Obviously, like sometimes that can go crazy and they can be like nearly in a cult. Not all times, but sometimes. But point is like, you could try to pick up on whether people in the lab get along with each other. And it might be hard to see that if you're just kind of like meeting them on Zoom or like having one-on-one conversations. But I would say if they tend to bring up a lot of the other people in the lab and talk about what they're doing and interactions that they have with each other, it's probably a good sign that it's a pretty like cooperative lab and people work together on things and they're not kind of siloed on their own projects. Okay, I'll ask a question to bring up something that we started talking about before, and I think relates well to this lab environment question. So if you're doing a rotation with the lab, what sort of things should you be looking for as part of your rotation process to help you decide if the lab is a good fit for you? So it could be related to like the environment, it could be related to any aspect of the rotation. And maybe also, what was your strategy for rotations if you had a choice in the matter? Okay, I'll start a little bit. So in MIT's grad program, it's like kind of in the biological engineering one, I should say, it was sort of like a chaotic free-for-all 3-month rotation period or so. So you could join a lab right away. Some people, a couple people in my department or in my class even joined sort of in the lead up summer to starting the program. So they already were like set in the lab before they started officially. But for the most part, it's kind of free form, so we could do whatever we wanted. I tried to like strategically set the labs I was most interested in to interact with right away, because something that can happen with rotations is that if there's a lot of interest in the lab, they might go with somebody who was there earlier in the rotation process that may have come to some sort of agreement about joining the lab sooner than somebody that rotated later. So I would try to prioritize early the ones that you're most interested in. You can use the rotations to check out a lab. In my case, I could just like go to group meetings. I could meet and hang out with the students, shadow them. It didn't have to be like me doing lab work, but in some cases I did do lab work to kind of get a feel for operating in the lab, especially for the ones I was most interested in, so that I could, you know, see what it's like, learn some of those skills from the lab, so that even if I didn't join the lab, I would potentially be able to like, you know, use some of those skills or connect with that lab as part of a collaboration. And I know some people have been that are forced into longer rotations. Like some programs have like 2-month rotation periods, and they're sort of fixed to line them up so that the labs that you're rotating in are potentially going to be like committee members on your thesis, or people that you're thinking about putting on your committee. Obviously, it doesn't have to be set in stone at that point. Could be to set up for some sort of collaboration or connecting labs together. So you can be sort of starting to lay the groundwork for your thesis in that way, even if you don't know which lab is going to end up being your main lab. You're not necessarily going to be like just fully over on one side in the corner, not interacting with the other labs. So try to use it to like learn and connect. Okay. And okay, does anybody have any final thoughts on rotations? Any experiences from yours you want to talk about? Yes.
I didn't personally rotate, but we did have a lot of rotational students come through the lab. And from the other side, one thing that we looked for was the willingness to learn new techniques and adapt to the lab, because every lab does things differently. And you make like a solution and you may make it one way in your previous lab, but your new lab is going to make it another way. And so being willing to adapt to the new lab's way of doing things was really important for us. Because it just shows that they're willing to do things how you do them for safety reasons or whatever other reason, whether your PI wants it like that or not. And that was a really important thing that we considered when choosing rotational students.
Yeah, I think for us, we often would have the rotation students sort of like attached to like a grad student or a postdoc in the lab. And so they would help out with a project, just in case anybody's wondering about how this often works. Sometimes a rotation student will be given like a fresh project, but that's pretty rare. Usually you're like helping somebody out with something. So it's a good way to like get a lot of interaction with one of the people where you might be like continuing their PhD project in the future. Or, you know, helping out with their project as like the first co-author publication that you work on before really diving into your first project that you run. So this can be sort of a launchpad moment. Definitely a good way to like interact with students in the lab and get to know what's going on in general. So don't just like be heads down on whatever thing. Like it's not about like trying to produce as much data as possible in your rotation. It's about like learning about the lab and about potential for doing a thesis in that lab. But you're going to do probably some lab work to like kind of get a feel for it and see if it's the kind of thing that you want to work on. So some PIs, even in like a rotation structure that doesn't force lab work, will want people to do the lab work to see if they actually like doing it or not. It's not really like a test of can you do it? It's like, is this what you enjoy doing? Is this a good fit for you? So it's not always like a test, is what I want to get across there. Okay. And okay, so again, like if you have questions, feel free to put them into the chat. We'll do one more prepared question here, and then I might grab things from the forum if people aren't putting questions in the chat. So, okay, the last thing to ask the panel from our set of questions is, was there anything like you wish you had known back in the day, or that was sort of unexpected related to this whole like choosing a program or lab process? Okay, I'll jump in with one thing while you guys think. So one thing I didn't really consider initially was that you can be co-advised by multiple PIs, which is a not uncommon thing in a lot of student experiences. So I didn't start being co-advised, but by the end of my first year of grad school, I had like picked up a second co-advisor, basically because I joined one lab and then I took a class from another that I was really interested in. And they had started collaborating on other stuff, and they're like, we could come up with a collaborative project together. So it wasn't something that I had thought about before, but it's something that you could potentially do again as like part of a rotation strategy, or during your interviews, thinking about like who collaborates with who. Is there potential to do a co-advising? I wouldn't usually start with that conversation, but it's something to keep in the back of your mind. There's a lot of things that get added on, extra responsibilities if you're co-advised, like going to meetings for both labs and so on, but there's also a lot of opportunities because you can immerse yourself in multiple groups and learn a lot from both sides.
I think kind of off of that point too, the department that I'm in is highly collaborative, and a lot of the PIs like to collaborate and co-advise students, like Ross was just mentioning. But I think something that's interesting, a couple folks that I know have done, if they really like two PIs and two PIs really like them, they've opened the conversation kind of in the advisor selection process or early in their process of doing their project about saying like, hey, what if we went in this direction and kind of, we're at the interface of these two labs. How would you feel about that? Do you think there's potentially funding for that, or could I help write a grant for that? And I know a handful of people who have actually built their own project that way, partially because as they were doing it, they couldn't decide which PI they wanted to work with. And so they just kind of, brute force their way into working with both of them. But that's definitely something to consider, that just in that front, and then also just in the grand scheme of how projects kind of come about. They're depending on the funding situation in labs too. If there's something a lab isn't working on, but there's something that you see that maybe your skills and your interests match for, that's similar to a lot of the stuff they're doing in the lab. I don't think it's totally, out of bounds to even pitch a project and be like, hey, would you be willing, to let me try to work on this even as a side project for now? And then maybe if we get good data, we could write a grant for it. I think those kind of things. The PhD is a very fluid process, so don't feel like you're totally married to whatever project you pick, and even your advising situation. You have at least some control, at least to suggest and try to carve out what those things look like.
Yeah, to add on to a little bit about the point of writing grants, it's not uncommon, or maybe likely, that your PhD project will sort of seed grants in the future, right? So you're not necessarily coming in on something that's just like preordained. Here's the grant, you're going to do this. Sometimes you'll start there and then it'll go off, and then at some point in your second year, after you've written your prospectus or like your thesis proposal, or your third year, or maybe later on once you've generated most of the data for your thesis, you might be also working on grants related to that. So setting up the person after you, or if it's earlier in your PhD, taking your like thesis proposal and turning that into a grant that will help to fund the later part of your PhD. And so when we've talked about like, asking PIs about their funding situation, this is something that's also going to evolve over time and that you may be involved in. And I would say if you're interested in like an academic career, whether it's being faculty or just in general doing academic research, asking about like grant writing experience and opportunities in a lab might be a good thing to check in on.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think you can also collaborate with like other labs and other PIs without someone having to like co-advise you. And I think I've done it for some of my projects where I was just talking to someone and I found like the discussion to be interesting and just committed some time like meeting like every couple of weeks. And I think that turned out to be like pretty good. So in that way, like you don't have to like commit to like a specific lab to like attend the lab meetings and other things, but you can like definitely talk to like other PIs around.
When I first started grad school, I had like my mentor, and then I made my thesis committee, and I was always under the impression that your mentor is kind of the main person that you go to for your science questions, life questions, like really anything. And I didn't really consider going to anybody else on my committee for any of those topics. And then my mentor actually passed away 2 years into my PhD. And the rest of my committee really came together and provided like all of the research and scientific and life support that I needed. And I never even thought to lean on them for anything else. And so it was unexpected to me to learn that your committee is there for a reason. You don't just have one mentor, and they're there for really whatever you need to help guide you through those 5 to however many years of your PhD. And so I just, yeah, surprised how much I actually ended up leaning on the other 4 members of them.
Yeah, that's something too you can ask students in the lab is like, who do they put on their committees? And, what do those interactions look like? And so that can help to sort of like broaden your understanding of the interactions in the department, even when you're just like in your interview stage.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, also like chatting with your committee member outside like regular committee meetings is also like kind of important because they're also going to write letters for you like later on in your career. So I think like maintaining like connections with them like even outside like your like annual committee meetings also probably something that's like highly recommended.
Okay, so go ahead and raise your hand if you have questions or put them in the chat. And we'll go on for another like 5-10 minutes of Q&A before we wrap this up. Certainly be done by 12:30 Pacific time. So while we're waiting for some questions from the audience related to this, a common thing in the sign-up form was about like red flags or green flags to look out for when you're doing these interviews and deciding on which lab to go to. So does anybody want to comment on some red flags and maybe green flags?
I think we've touched on this a bit, but definitely a red flag will be if you ask the professor and the grad students the same questions and you get very different answers from people. I think that's something that's super important to do. So like, for example, asking the professor what their mentorship style is or how, like what their policy for taking vacation time is, because my professor's very chill. He doesn't really care as long as you're getting your work done. Some people are very more professional, so to speak, about it. And so if you get the answer from the professor that, oh yeah, just kind of whatever, do your thing. But if the grad students say, oh no, like you need to submit 2 weeks in advance or something like that, that's definitely a red flag.
I think a really easy way to screen people out that I would have never thought to ask when I was going through the process, but I get this question pretty much every year at recruiting events, where there's always at least one student that's like, if there's one faculty in the department that everybody would say don't work for, who is it? And typically in most departments, you kind of have an answer right off the top of your head. And so that's just a way to, because, kind of like we've been saying, you're always going to get the best from them when you're in a one-on-one, interview with them. But that is a quick way to screen. Just make sure that, that maybe there might be a bad lab culture or something going on in one of these labs.
I think that's also a really good point about asking the other grad students in the department, because the people in that lab are not necessarily going to go, yeah, don't join this lab, it's bad for XYZ reason. Like, that's a tough cognitive burden to get over for them. But yeah, I think that's a really good point to ask other.
To add on to that, not even the grad students currently in the lab, but past grad students who have graduated out of the lab can really give you some true insight on what it was like to be in the lab. And if like also other PIs around the nation are asking you, why are you joining this lab? Do you have any other options? That is definitely a red flag that you might want to reconsider where you're going.
Okay, so I saw a couple questions in the chat. So first I'll ask the question from Ian, which is about for people who are co-advised. So what were the main benefits and challenges? Was getting funding and support difficult, or was it straightforward? And did it provide additional research freedom? So great questions. Ross, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can take this away. So I'm co-advised, and I was the first co-advised student between my PIs. And so there was a little bit of kind of carving out what that relationship looked like. In terms of funding, that was already kind of sorted out. I think a lot of times if there's a pre-existing, like a co-advised project that's offered, typically that's already on a grant that's kind of been co-advised. And so a lot of times I think, at least in my experience in my department, that's kind of what that looks like. In terms of the benefits and challenges, so I mentioned earlier, one of the things that I was looking for was career development when I was looking for a PI. And so I liked the idea of having two PIs, two people in your corner who can kind of bat for you, use their network of connections. So that's really good. You get kind of two levels of support. And then in the same vein, you get two different levels or two different kind of realms of research expertise too, where you can get help on a lot of different things, depending on which PI you're kind of asking your questions to, and you can get different points of view. The cons, then you'll have a lot of meetings because you'll probably go to, group meetings for both PIs, meetings with collaborators if it's a highly collaborative project, all those kind of things. And then you'll have, just as you get two people supporting you, you'll have two people asking you to do things, whether that's, put figures together for a presentation, help write a grant, trying to get you to write a manuscript, whatever that is. You'll kind of have two people in your ear getting you to do those things. And so I think it's just figuring out what that looks like. I think I would definitely, if there is an existing co-advisement situation, because a lot of times these co-advised projects, they'll go on, for potentially, many years and many grants. And so if the PIs have co-advised a student before, I would definitely ask what that relationship looks like, because I think my PIs do a really good job of having a good, relationship that benefits me and they both benefit and the project goes well. But I know other folks who really their co-advisement has, more or less collapsed, and they've just kind of ended up in one of the lab, and they just kind of have another advisor on paper. And so, because there wasn't a great relationship between the two PIs.
Yeah, a couple of things that I'll add on to this because I was co-advised as well. I think in my case, it was an unofficial co-advisement. So I think that technically only one of them was on paper my PI, but for all intents and purposes, I had two, which included like when I would do my committee meetings. At MIT, they started doing this thing where like they kick out the student, they talk about the student, and then they kick out the advisors, and then they talk to the other committee members talk to the student about their impression of how things are going with their advisor or without their advisor present. And so for mine, even though the second co-advisor was not officially my co-advisor, it was like close enough to where she would also leave. And so that was sort of an interesting outcome from that. Other things. So as far as funding went, this can be like a lot of ways. It might be like a shared grant, which is something that like eventually we had for the co-advising situation that I was in. But I think initially it was, I was funded on a grant from one of the labs, and then at some point I was funded on a grant from the other lab, and it kind of bounced back and forth depending on how the funding situation came and went. But once we had like set up some grants that I had helped write, then I had like sort of a direct home for me that sat at the intersection of the two labs. So the funding, I wouldn't worry too much about. The PIs can figure that out on the back end, and it can be pretty flexible with funding. And so it tends not to be too much of an issue. But yeah, I don't think I have too much more to add on top of what Ross said. Lots of meetings, but you can make a lot out of it for sure. Okay, so there was a question about how many PhD programs did you apply to in the first place? And maybe we can ask sort of the more generalized question to this, which is like, how did you decide which programs to apply to in the first place when you don't know a lot of the information that we've been talking about in this interview process? I'd say maybe like for reference, the panelists, about half the people that signed up haven't necessarily like applied yet. So there's probably a lot of people thinking about this stuff in the future tense.
I think for me to kind of identify programs that I was interested in applying for, I asked around at my undergrad institution, some of the professors that either I did research with or taught classes kind of in, the general engineering biology area. And I was like, hey, here are the kind of things that I want to do. Do you know who does these kind of things, good programs to apply for? And then that actually lowered a lot of the activation energy for me, because then, I had a couple people who were willing to make introductions for me and those kind of things. And then I was able to kind of meet with some of these people before I even went through the application process. And yeah, so that's kind of how I went about it.
Yeah, so I didn't have as clear of an idea of what exactly I wanted to work on for my PhD when I was initially applying. So I started in thinking about places that I would want to live and then what universities were in those cities. So I kind of made my short list of, here are my criteria for what place I want to be in for the next 5 years, and then looked at what programs were there and what sort of labs were in those departments, and are they things that were interesting to me, and then created the list that way.
When I was applying, I was sort of torn between synthetic biology, systems biology. So I was kind of looking at places that were kind of good in one and or the other, and had a lot of options as far as like labs that I could potentially join. And so that kind of focused the search. And then also like during rotations, I was looking at labs on either side of that. And so that was sort of like the strategy that I was looking for. And I think I applied to like 15 schools or something like that for reference.
Yeah, I'm just gonna add something about like international students. So like this is something that I just got to know when it was like pretty close to like the application deadlines. So like if you are like an international student, like I was from like India, so some programs have like some kind of like upper limit on how many international students they can take, right? So that's why if you apply to programs which have like a greater intake rate, I mean, for example, if they take like maybe like 30 or 40 like students every year, that just maximizes like your chance of getting in there. So I think this is something that I didn't know about. So I applied to some of the programs, like one of them was like MIT's like microbiology program, in which they literally take like 7 students maybe. So like your chance of getting there as like an international student is like close to 0. So that's why I think like just figuring out programs where there's like a huge intake, or like if you already know like they take like international students at like a pretty good rate, I think these are all going to like help you in optimizing your applications.
Yeah, and to add on to that, we SPA are planning up a couple of things around like international students. And those might touch on applying as an international student, but also touch on things like visas and like adaptation to the new environment if you're coming to the US. And so we do plan to have some support specifically for international students in the future. So if you're potentially coming from outside of the US into the US, we hope to have some things that would be of interest for applicants as well. Okay, so any final thoughts on the panel before we wrap it up? Okay. Sounds like we've said all we wanted to say. Okay, so thanks everyone. So 1 second, let me get to my wrap-up text here. Okay, so thanks again to all the panelists for coming on. This is a really nice discussion and a lot of good perspectives from different angles here. This recording is going to be posted on YouTube, so if you want, for you in the audience, if you want to refer back to it, or panelists, if you'd like to share it abroad, it will be put on EBRC's YouTube channel. I'll put a couple of links on here, including the link to the YouTube channel, as well as another one that's a website about advice from scientists to scientists. So if you're sort of applying to grad school, there's additional articles in there that can be helpful. So this is another production of the Engineering Biology Research Consortium Student and Postdoc Association. If you're a current grad student, if you're a master's student right now, you can actually join EBRC or join the SPA. And so you can check us out on our website. I put the link in the chat, just ebrc.org. If you're currently an undergrad, we have like a future SPA pipeline where you can join the Slack. Many of you already indicated to join the Slack. Thank you for doing so. But SPA is like a great thing for grad students and postdocs in the field of engineering biology, or if you're working adjacent to it. We put on a lot of events like this one targeted towards professional development and career development of people working in this space and making connections among people spread out across the engineering biology community, mostly in the US, but increasingly international and abroad. I'm actually in Canada right now. So yeah, just a big thanks to everyone. Thanks again to the panel. Thanks to the other people in EBRC SPA that have helped with this behind the scenes. And we look forward to our next event coming up in the next month or two. So bye, everyone.